Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a sunset sky in acrylics. Now this is going to focus on the sky portion, but at the end of this video I'm going to show you how you can add a silhouette of any animal, could be your pet or a commission, to create a really nice dramatic painting. Now the first thing here is, as you can see, I am just blocking in the base colour. I really don't mind what colour it is, I just wanted to make sure that the white of the canvas was covered up. So a big part of this technique is making sure that the paint doesn't have any chance to dry before you blend it. So in order to achieve that, we're going to be using a fine mist sprayer bottle. Now as you can see here, I am explaining what I'm doing as I'm going, because this tutorial is available on my Patreon channel all in real time. There are no sections sped up or cut out, and I am explaining everything while I'm painting. So what you're going to be seeing here is occasionally a fine mist of water is applied to my surface, and I'm then going to apply the paint on top and use a blending brush to soften out that paint into the existing dry layer underneath. Now what's important about using the spray bottle is that you don't apply too much water. You can see here that no part of that water is ever running down my surface. However, what can happen is too much water is applied and then you start to get droplets of water run down your canvas. Now that obviously is something that's going to cause problems, so you want to dry that, either wait for it to dry naturally or you can use your hairdryer. Or another issue that can happen, like in this top corner, is the paint starts to dry where the water has evaporated there, and then the paint starts to almost tack up and you grip onto your blending brush. Now when you have that happen, you want to apply a little bit more water, more paint, and then you can blend that back out. Now because I do record these tutorials with a voiceover while I'm painting, when those issues happen, I make sure that they are all included in that real-time version. So I show you how to fix those mistakes, just like how I pointed out here, there was a little bit that was getting a bit stuck. This is one of those times where I'm showing my Patreon members how to fix it. This is totally normal and it happens to any painting. There is a bit of a fine balance between how much water should be applied for how much blending and softness we want. Now the wonderful thing about working with acrylics like this is we can keep on layering very quickly, but you do want to be making sure that once you're happy with the stage of your painting, like I am here, that you give that a chance to dry. Now the reason being, if you still carry on applying layer upon layer and the layer underneath is still wet, you are going to then end up with too much moisture on the surface. So you then end up with something where it starts to bead up, and that's then going to end up lifting when you go back in with your blending brush. So any points where I was happy with the sky, this is where I also made sure to allow it to completely dry. Now if you are using a hairdryer to speed up your acrylic drying time, you do want to be making sure that you're holding that hairdryer away from your painting. You don't want to hold it right up close, and I always recommend to keep your hand moving. You don't want your hairdryer directed at one point on your canvas. Now I do have an airbrush set up that I could have used to create this sunset sky, and it would have been very quick. But I do like to be able to use the blending brushes and using traditional brushwork to create effects like this, because these blending techniques also really help when working with specific fur textures. So if you're working maybe, let's say, on a long-haired cat and that fur on the body is really soft, these blending techniques can be used in that situation as well. Now if you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this, it is available on my Patreon now. You do get the reference photo, line art and full material list. So if you are interested in that or any of my other tutorials, I will link that in the description below. Now like with all of my tutorials here on YouTube, I always talk about the importance of layers. This is so important with anything that we are painting. It really doesn't matter what it is. If we're only working with 2 or 3 layers, we're not going to have that realistic look that we're aiming for. So I actually lost count with the amount of layers that I was adding here, and at this stage of the painting, this is where I wanted to start darkening it up and hyping up my contrast. Now the importance of contrast is something that I talk about in all of my videos here on YouTube, and of course my in-depth tutorials on Patreon. The contrast for me is something that I feel brings more of that three-dimensional look and realism to a painting than worrying about the exact colour. Now you can see from that photo of my finished painting in the corner just how important the lights and darks are in the sky. So it's not just about the colour, although I've got really bright colour saturation here with beautiful yellows and oranges, that colour would not have the impact if I didn't have my lights and my darks accurate. So by going back in here and darkening up some of those shadows, and then in a moment I'm going to start to add in some of those lighter colours, that there is helping to build up more of that dramatic feel of the sky. So contrast and the values that we're using are so important. So earlier in the video I mentioned how I don't ever leave any of the mistakes out from the real-time versions on Patreon. It's something that I feel so passionate about. Learning from these mistakes and how to fix them is what makes us improve our painting and drawing skills. So you saw there that I did add far too much water to the surface, and all I've done there is I carried on blending, finishing the area that I was working on because I wanted to make sure that I did have that softened layer of paint. I don't want to leave any harsh edges to dry. That's going to be harder to fix in the long run. And then once I blended that out, I could then worry about fixing the water that had run down my surface. So one of the things that I learned when I was first new to using a fine mist spray bottle is how easy it is to add too much to the surface. It can be very frustrating to use early on. The one thing though, like with anything, is practice. The more we use it, the easier it gets. Now one thing that I do also talk about in the real-time version is the technique of using a fine mist sprayer bottle is very different to using a standard water bottle. Using a standard water bottle is not going to give you the same effect because what they do is actually apply larger droplets of water to the surface and you end up with way too much water in one go. So I would definitely recommend to invest in a fine mist sprayer bottle rather than a standard water bottle. You will really notice a difference with how much water is applied to your painting. So at this stage of the painting where I had hinted at the lights and the darks, I really wanted to start to adjust the colour and get that more for what I want for my painting. So what I did is now I'm working with glazes. Now you do want to wait for the paint underneath to completely dry before you work with glazes, but I do have a video here on YouTube that talks through everything that I use glazes for, and I've got various examples with different paintings showing the glazes in progress. So if that's of interest, I'll link that glazing video in the description below. Now once I'd adjusted the first layer of colour, you can see now that I'm going back in and adding more of my lighter clouds. This is going to be a bit more of a rinse and repeat process. So what I'll do here is add some more lighter clouds, I'll wait for that to dry, and then I'll add a glaze to adjust the colour and go back in with more of my highlights. Now what I was trying to reinforce here as well is getting a little bit more shape to the cloud. Of course this here is a bit more of a softer look, so you can't necessarily give clear definition to the cloud, not like those fluffier clouds that you can sometimes get. I didn't want that for this painting, but the techniques there would still be the same. You just wouldn't have to use quite so many blending techniques. Now I find for me that working with glazes and adjusting my colour like that makes the painting process more enjoyable and less stressful. I don't have to worry about mixing the exact colour at each stage. I can focus on that separately later on. Now that enables me then to just focus on my contrast, my lights and my darks. Now when painting animals with fur or feathers, that can make a huge difference to how we overcome certain aspects of a painting. So when, let's say, we're working on a complex bird, lots of feathers that are overlapping, if we only have to focus on layering the lights and the darks initially, we don't have to worry about colour. That's one big aspect of the painting that we don't have to fixate on at all at that stage. We can then really start to adjust the colour later with glazes, but it's all about building it up gradually, making each process as enjoyable and stress-free as possible. So if you haven't worked with glazes and you do find the colour aspect of it, the mixing of it, a bit more overwhelming, then working with glazes can really help. So at this stage of the painting, this is where I wanted to put in my subject. Now on the real-time version on Patreon, I actually intended to put a cat in for the main subject, but I really did like the sky so much that I wanted to turn this into a painting that I could keep for myself. So instead, I actually got a photo of my own dog that I sadly lost last year, and that I could make this into a painting to remember her by. Now one thing that I would recommend is to make sure that you're happy with an idea that you have in mind is ideally design it on a computer or sketch it out first. So what I did initially here is I actually put the photograph of Maisie on the reference photo background that I used. I merged a couple of photos together for that, and then I got the clear idea that yes, that photo will work and it will work with that background. The last thing I wanted to do here was change the concept last minute and then sort of spoil the painting after all of that work that I put into the background. So once I was happy with the layout there and I knew that this photo that I had in mind for Maisie would work, then I knew that I could then get that transferred onto my painting. And I was then even more excited for this tutorial to go live on Patreon, because it meant that my Patreon members could potentially change the tutorial and make one of their own pet as well. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really, really grateful. If you would like to paint along to the real-time version, as I've said earlier, it is all linked in the description below. But if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I do upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.